Hi, welcome to episode 17 of the Ukulele Sessions. Now, if like me you are an absolute nut for the ukulele, there is a book that you definitely need to read. The Ukulele, A History. Now, this book was written by Jim Tranquada and John King, and today I am joined by Jim Tranquada, the co-author of it. Jim is the great-great-grandson of Augusto Dias, one of the first ever ukulele manufacturers in the world. If you happen to capture episode 10 of the Ukulele Sessions, where I have a chat with Sean from Ukulele Friend, we discuss Augusto Dias in quite some depth, and actually Sean has some of the very first ukuleles with him, so do check that out. This book is one of my favourite books ever. I love the way that it's written. It's written chronologically right from the start. It goes back, everybody associates ukuleles with Hawaii, but this goes back to their real roots in Madeira. Although it's chronological, it's interspersed with sort of cultural and historical references to keep it interesting. I like it because it's written in a sort of a light way. It's not a heavy read at all, and it really goes into depth about how the ukulele came about and how it's ended up where it is now. So as well as looking at the manufacturing side, those early pioneers, it looks at the players as well and explains how the ukulele has ended up where it is. It could quite easily just have been a list of dates, but it is so much more than that, and I really recommend, if you're into the ukulele, you have a read of this book, you will not regret it. So because Jim has such a personal connection to the ukulele, his knowledge about it is just unbelievable. I mean, it was an absolute pleasure to chat to Jim. He knows so much about the history of the ukulele, both on the manufacturing side and the players and everything. He's been so involved with it and has that personal connection. It's a fascinating interview. I really enjoyed chatting to Jim. Do check out his and John's book. I hope you enjoy the interview. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit about your background, because you're the great-grandson of Augusto Dias, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, one of the three first ukulele, and I'm sure you're going to say ukulele, manufacturers in Hawaii. So I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about your background and how prevalent the ukulele was in your childhood.
Of course, Paul. As you probably know, Tranquada is a Portuguese name, and Portugal, of course, being the UK's oldest ally. The family's all from Madeira, and I make that distinction because most Portuguese in the States are from the Azores. My great-grandfather, Felge Tranquada, was a 16-year-old who stowed away on a boat to get away from Madeira in 1888. He married Carolina Dias, one of the six lovely Dias sisters, the daughters of Augusto. And her oldest son, my grandfather, was born and raised in Honolulu, went to the University of Hawaii for 2 years, then transferred to go to college on the mainland, which is where he met my grandmother. They got married, and he never went back to live in Hawaii. So I'm a third generation mainland Haole, as they would say in Hawaii. And oddly, the ukulele wasn't prevalent when I was growing up. No one in the immediate family played. What I grew up hearing, though, was stories about my great-great-grandfather, Augusto, which is how piqued my interest because I was curious to know whether those stories were true or not.
Right. Okay. So you knew that you had this history in your family, but you weren't surrounded by ukuleles and that, and it wasn't something that was passed down then, the manufacture of them.
No, the what makes the Kamaka family so remarkable is that they've managed to keep the business going as a family business for over a century. That's the Martin company is the other obvious example of that, but it's extremely rare, and none of the three original ukulele makers managed to do that.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, thank you for that. I heard this wonderful story that when your father wooed your mother, he took her out in a canoe and played the ukulele to her. So I was wondering, so obviously your father played. At what age did you start playing, Jim?
Well, I just, that story is true. And my brother and my sister and I are all grateful that my mother married him anyway. Um, uh, I didn't start playing until about 20 years ago. And I would describe my style as rudimentary. I'm not a musician. That gene skipped me, although some of my cousins are very talented uh, musicians and ukulele players. Uh, Rather than practice, I tend to do more research. So I have, in those 20 years, I've played in public once, and I think that is that speaks to my lack of skill and my consideration for others.
Okay, so your interest in the ukulele came prior to you playing it. Your interest in the history of the ukulele, yes?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Now, you are the author, the co-author of this wonderful book that I have here that you can see is very well read. So this is the ukulele history co-written with John King, of course. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to write that book with John.
I John's and my relationship was a long distance one. It was email and phone calls, really. And I emailed him in January 2002 because I had run across his book on early Hawaiian guitar makers and ordered a copy. And at that point, I was about 3 years into my own research in a serious way. And he responded politely, but when it became clear that I was as much of a ukulele geek and obsessive as he was, then within, it only took like 2 or 3 weeks, we had started collaborating on a journal article that was published in the Hawaiian Journal of History. And then when that was done, we kind of looked at each other and said, well, we should do a book. So we did. Because we were both frustrated with the kind of anecdotal and contradictory and unsourced history that was out there, and there wasn't. We wanted to write the book that we wished that was already in print that we could have read ourselves.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm very, very glad you did. So when you did the book, I mean, it must have been fascinating from your side. Did you unearth much stuff that you weren't aware of in your own family history?
I did. There's one thing I learned still mystifies me to this day. All three of the original makers, Diaz, Nunez, and Santu, constantly moved their shops in Honolulu. My grandfather moved his shop at least 12 times in 16 years. I have no idea why. Were they not paying the rent? I don't know. And my great great grandfather had a lot of bad luck. He was burned out 3 times and lost his shop and all of his inventory 3 times. And he kind of seemed to be a magnet for trouble. His shop was burglarized several times. And in one case, in 1894, the burglar tried to set fire to the shop to cover his tracks. There was a member of a local gambling ring who tried to stash his paperwork in Grandpa Diaz's shop when he was fleeing the police. Grandpa was called to testify in the trial of an individual who was accused of bombing the Portuguese consul's house because he had overheard him threatening this guy while he was in the shop. And he was short. He was barely 5 feet tall, and he seems to have had a short man's temper. He once shoved a guy through a shop window when they had an argument. The other thing, and one thing that disappointed me to learn about my great-great-grandfather was that he, in 1894, he signed a loyalty oath to the provisional government after the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. That was a surprise, and I wasn't particularly happy to find that out.
That's fascinating stuff. Yeah, it must have been very, very interesting for your family as well to hear this stuff unearthed.
Yeah, some of the personal details I discovered, I don't think all the cousins were thrilled to hear.
Yeah, and then to put
But
them in
to me,
print.
but to me, it's all part of the story, and I think that's some of the most interesting parts, actually.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. You must be very proud looking back at what your family have achieved. I mean, to be related to these first makers who made amazing instruments, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. But it's not as if they were making these cheap things that people just bought, tourists bought. These were proper, beautiful instruments, of which we will talk about in a little bit. So you must be very, very proud.
Um, the whole family's proud, and I wouldn't discount the tourist trade because that quickly became an important part of the business, I think, for all three of the makers. And not that many original instruments, of course, have survived. And the ones that have survived, it's not clear whether they survived because they're the higher end models and were more expensive and therefore more likely to be preserved. Because you certainly see in the evolution of the instruments that decisions were made to make it cheaper and quicker to build instruments so that you don't have a separate fingerboard. You're just mounting the frets directly into the neck, and you're not doing a button bridge. You're doing a slotted bridge, which is cheaper and easier to make. And you don't have the extended fingerboard with 17 frets. You just have a 12 fret that ends at the top of the upper bout. Those are all, I think, not stylistic or aesthetic decisions. They're decisions that you're making when you're trying to crank out product for the trade and then at a reasonable price.
I wonder if that went against what Augusto believed in a way, because I'm assuming he started as a furniture maker.
Well, all three started as furniture makers, and I've been unable to find any evidence that they made instruments back in Funchal in Madeira. But the extent of their technique, particularly in the earliest instruments, argues that they must have made instruments in Madeira before they came to Hawaii. But in all the documentation we found, they're identified back in Madeira as marceneiros, as cabinet makers.
Yeah, so I wonder if that sort of then to go into potentially a cheap range of ukuleles. I wonder how he felt about that. It'd be interesting to know, wouldn't it?
It would. It's hard from his perspective, and all three of them. They were hustling to make a living, and they opened up their shops in Chinatown, which was the worst slum in Honolulu because that's where the rent was cheap. And they all had big families that they had to support. So in looking back, 125, 140 years later, these instruments take on a real significance that this was business for them. So it can become difficult to separate the way we look at them today with how they were originally viewed when they were first built and they were out on the counter for sale.
Yeah, indeed. I think also it's beautiful that you're very, very proud of your background, and I'm sure they'd be incredibly proud of you for writing such a fitting history to them and bringing it to people like me.
I think in part they would just be impressed that I can read and write because literacy among the Portuguese immigrants to Hawaii at this time in the 19th century was very low. The Hawaiian rate of literacy was somewhere like 85, 90%, and among the Portuguese it was maybe 20%. So I know my great-great-grandfather could write his name. I'm not sure how much more than that he could do. And when Jose do Espiritu Santo signed his loyalty oath, he just made a mark. He signed it with an X because he couldn't sign his name.
Wow. Do we know if any of the real early players could write music then? One assumes not.
Manuel Nunes didn't play at all.
Right.
Santu, I don't know. My great-great-grandfather had a reputation as a musician and someone who could play not only rasgueado, strumming, but punteado. He could pick a melody on the ukulele.
Yeah.
Um, Whether they composed, nothing. Certainly, nothing has survived. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. I wanted to talk about John King a little bit because obviously you
Love,
knew him, and I mean he's obviously done this book and he's done a couple of other books as well. And I'm a big fan of his. His book Classical Ukulele was very influential and very popular over here. Still many
Good.
years later. What was John like?
Well, I have to say that there are many people who knew him better than I because our relationship was long distance. I only had a chance to hang out with him in person a handful of times in the 7 years that I knew him before his untimely death. Um, I think people tend to forget that he was trained as a classical guitarist
Yeah.
by Celedonio and Pepe Romero, and that he taught guitar at Eckerd College for 30 years and was an associate editor of Soundboard magazine, which is the Guitar Foundation of America quarterly. And he edited several editions of classical pieces, and he owned some one-of-a-kind manuscripts by Sor and Corelli, and he published some of his own guitar compositions.
Yeah.
So that's the background that he applied to ukulele and his music and his history. John was really a one-of-a-kind person. He had very high standards that he held himself to in his writing, in his research, in his music. He was very focused and precise. I mean, he's the kind of guy who could tell you that he had his first ukulele lessons in Honolulu in April of 1960 when he was 6 years old. I mean, that's just the way John was. And his dad was a Navy pilot, so they moved around a lot. He was, I'm proud to say, a California native. He was born in San Diego. But he never did anything halfway. He was always all in, in for a penny, in for a pound. I remember that walking around music festivals or expos with John was kind of like walking around with a rock star.
Yeah, how fantastic.
When people approached us, they were always approaching us because, oh my God, that's John King. But he was always just totally unassuming and approachable. He was always really generous with his knowledge. He was an intimidating figure, and I think that's one reason why my ukulele skills have remained so rudimentary. When your partner, your working partner, is this incredible musician with this amazing technique that that's the result of decades of study and practice. It's a little intimidating. But he was a really sweet guy. Now, in private, he could be kind of blunt and hilarious in his critique of others because he had very high standards and he was always disappointed when other people didn't meet those standards. But he was as a person, he was just a lovely guy. He was just an obsessive like me. Some people, I think, considered him an eccentric, but he had other interests. He had an amazing collection of Hawaiian shirts.
Yeah, 300, I believe.
400 actually.
400.
Yeah. So he could wear a different one every day of the year, and he was kind of proud of the fact that he had a different one that he could wear every day of the year. He loved. It's interesting because John got nervous before he performed. And you'd think someone with his command would be confident, but he got nervous, and I saw that. And it's one of the reasons why he liked, when he was in St. Petersburg, his hometown of Florida, he liked to go to the local Starbucks and just play there because nobody knew him, no expectations, or sit on a bench in Waikiki and just play because other people enjoyed it. But John, the nerves went away because it wasn't what he considered a performance. He was just noodling around. And People forget, I mean, John was an entrepreneur. You know, he published his own books, he published his own music and CDs.
Yeah.
He was really technically savvy in the studio and on computers. He was really a remarkable guy. I still miss him today.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure also he was probably a little bit nervous. I guess maybe he was the only one doing it. I know there were other players around, brilliant players, Lyle Ritz, etc. But really, he was the pioneer on the classical front. So to put yourself out there, you know, now there's quite a few people doing it. I wonder if that had something to do with it as well.
Um, I think so. I mean, I think John enjoyed being sort of a one of a kind player. But I think it also had to do with his very high standards. He demanded a lot of himself as a musician. But I was always impressed that, you know, occasionally he'd misplay something, there'd be a little flub, but he was a real pro. He just kept right on going. And if you weren't, you know, completely familiar with the music, you might not have even noticed that there was a technical glitch in his playing.
Well, that gives us all hope.
Yeah, it is. It's nice to know that even the immortals can make a mistake.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm sure John must have seen something very special in your writing, your history and your knowledge to want to do the book 50/50 with you. So that's, again, a beautiful partnership that happened there. I read somewhere that something that you want people to take from the ukulele is, and this goes back to what we were saying about John, that it's a real instrument. My gut feeling, A, is that John did an incredible amount to make it recognised as a real instrument, and B, and I don't know if this is just because I'm so into it, I get the feeling that is happening now. What's your feeling on that, Jim?
John insisted on playing a soprano because, you know, he can, you know, like a baritone, for example, he just considered a guitar. He already knew how to play the guitar, and he wanted the technical challenge. He wanted to master the technical challenge of playing this small instrument with this small fingerboard yeah, with his giant fingers. I don't know how he did it. And he always corrected people who said that the ukulele was easy to play. You know, you can certainly say, well, it's easy to pick up and learn 3 chords as I did, but it's incredibly difficult to learn to play well and to really master the instrument. I think I'm encouraged by the fact that when people write about the ukulele nowadays, there are far fewer references to Tiny Tim and George Formby, who shaped people's image of the ukulele for the baby boomer generation, certainly. And I think players like Jake Shimabukuro have done a lot to show people what the possibilities of the ukulele are, and there are many other talented players out there, including yourself, who are showing people exactly the same thing. But I think if you read the press coverage of Jake as he travels around the world, you still tend to get the, oh my gosh, look what this guy can do on the ukulele. And I think that if you look at the industry as a whole, and you read trade magazines in the music industry, the guitar still dominates people's thinking, and the ukulele is kind of an afterthought, even though its sales have doubled or even tripled over the past decade. It's still not taken as seriously at by the trade or at the trade shows or you know, any other places. We still have a ways to go.
Yeah. I think a lot of that, to my mind, depends on how much new material is written for the ukulele. I think that's where the future lies for the ukulele. People writing good stuff specifically for the ukulele.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right.
So I wanted to jump around a little bit. Something that fascinated me in your book, if we think about the machete at the moment, I can never understand how and you may correct me if I'm wrong here, but the ukulele sort of usurped the machete. The machete didn't survive, did it? Really? Am I correct in saying that? And I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, it didn't. The machete didn't survive as the machete in Hawaii, certainly, and uh, it, if you look at the parallel between, I mean, because the machete, of course, is still a big part of the musical cultural in Madeira today, even though it's called the briguinha now instead
Yeah.
of the machete. But if you look at the difference between what happened in Hawaii with the machete and what happened in the UK, for example, with the machete, because people were bringing machetes back from Madeira to the UK in the 19th century because a lot of British tourists went to Madeira. It was a health resort. Um, and I think part of the difference is just the culture. There was an existing guitar culture, an emerging guitar culture in Hawaii when the machete showed up, and it easily fit into that culture. And then the politics, Hawaii was annexed to the United States, and there was all these Hawaiian musicians who were working on the mainland. Um, in UK, there wasn't really a lot of respect for stringed instruments in the 19th century and early 20th century. I mean, Philip Bone wrote his famous book on the guitar and mandolin in 1914, in part to demonstrate that, hey, look, the guitars are, I mean, it was interesting, the parallels to me. Just as today we're trying to convince people that the ukulele is a real instrument, folks like Bone were trying to persuade folks in the UK that the guitar and the mandolin were real instruments and were capable of playing classical music and so on and so forth. So I think there's some cultural differences as to why it took off in Hawaii and on the mainland in the continental United States and didn't in places like the UK. The UK was even slow to adapt to the ukulele. It wasn't really until the mid to late 20s that the ukulele really took off in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, they often say that the guitar wasn't taken seriously until Segovia got his hands on it.
Exactly.
So yeah, okay, thank you for that. That's fantastic. Now, recently I did a lovely interview with Sean Yakavone from Ukulele Friend, and he had with him in the interview 3 of the earliest ukuleles. I'm wondering, have you played them? Have you had your hands on a Diaz?
I'm lucky in that I have been able to handle 5 Diaz ukuleles.
Wow.
There's one left in the family. One of the cousins in Honolulu has it. It's and built in 1894. It's just gorgeous, the flame koa on this thing. It was built by Grandpa Diaz for his oldest grandson, and it's stayed in the family since then. And it's the only example I'm aware of that's playable. I mean, it's been repaired. It's got new tuners. It's got a new bridge.
Yeah.
But it's playable. And it's that's the only one that I've been able to play. One of the Diages that Sean has now is one that I could have bought in 2004 had I $12,000.
Ouch.
And that obviously didn't happen. So this is the closest I will ever get to a Diaz. This is a replica of maybe 1886, 1887 model that's owned by a collector up in the Bay Area. And Michael Da Silva, who's this amazing luthier, built this replica for me in 2007.
Wow, what a cool thing.
It's got this sort of distinctive Madeiran machete shape, and got the extended fingerboard and all that stuff, and it's got friction tuners, wooden tuners.
Yeah.
So this is probably, I mean, just given that I'm not a millionaire, this is probably the closest that I will get to owning a Diaz.
Yeah, it's beautiful that you've played it. How did that make you feel when you played it?
Well, it's if you think about the broader context, all the ukuleles that were played went by the royal family in Hawaii, and all the pioneering performances on the mainland at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, and it was either made by Nunez or Santu or Dias. So my ancestors' instruments played a critical role in this popularization of Hawaiian music, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, the ukulele has become a lot more popular in past 25 years. But I'm proud to be able to say that my family was playing the ukulele before it was the ukulele.
Yeah, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So, how do you feel that the sort of manufacture of them, or the making of them, shall we say, how do you feel that's changed over the years?
The original makers were, they were one-person shops. They were sort of classic luthiers, and they made each instrument by hand. And when mass production took over with Nunez, when it became Nunez and Sons in 1909, 1910, and then Jonah Kumalae and the other major Hawaiian makers, and then that really took off in Chicago, which became the world leader in ukulele manufacture around World War One. Mass production techniques obviously made a difference. What strikes me most now is how little has changed, in that if you look at the early ukuleles, all the shapes are different, and they're playing around with different peg heads, and hey, let's put a banjo peg head on this one, and let's experiment with different kinds of woods, and you see the same thing today, the same kind of product diversification that you saw in the 20s with ukuleles, with different, celebrity endorsements and different colors and different shapes and different sizes. And same thing's going on today, because once a product becomes popular, you need to differentiate your product in some way. And so the same thing's happening today.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have a preference for wood other than koa?
I'm a traditionalist. The replica that Michael made for me, it's koa back and sides, and it's got a salvaged fir top, which is more in keeping with classical lutherie. I prefer koa. I'm old fashioned that way, and for me it's not just a question of the sound, but the koa wood has a long association with Hawaiian royalty. And in the 1890s, after the overthrow of the monarchy, it became a political symbol of aloha aina, love of the land. And so there's a whole sort of cultural and political part of koa that goes beyond the musical aspects that a strict musician would be paying attention to.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, funnily enough, the two that are sat here, this one's mango, and this is a acacia. Now, I heard somewhere, and I'm not too up on these things, but is that related to koa, or am I incorrect?
Yeah, koa is a kind of acacia. I mean, that
Right.
is unique to the United States, and it's not too different than the kind of materials that the three original makers would have used in Madeira to make machete or guitars, violas, back in Funchal.
Yeah. Yeah, I must admit, recently I have seen some sort of new designs coming out that are fairly radical and fairly contemporary. So it will be interesting to see where the market goes, really, because I think recently there's been a lot of developments that I don't know. Some of them, there's a lot of 5-string ukes coming out, ones with double with the octave strings and things like that. But mainly in the shape and size, it will be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, again, this has this kind of experimentation, which I think is driven by the fact that there's koa is expensive. There's a shortage. There's a shortage of rosewood and mahogany and other traditional woods. That just encourages that kind of that experimentation, to use mango or spalted maple or non-organic materials as well in building ukulele. I mean, plastics are still plastics are still big.
Yeah, yeah. It will be sort of interesting to see where that goes, really, won't it? Because I think there's the environmental side, isn't it? Okay, arguably ukuleles are quite small, but when there's 250,000 of them in England being sold every year. So there's the environmental impact as well, isn't there? Really?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I think ultimately it's the musicians who are going to have the final say, because if it looks fantastic and sounds bad, you're not going to have much of a market for it.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Well, this has been fantastic. I've got a couple of questions for you that I'd still just like to ask, if that's okay. So, is there anything that you're working on at the moment, ukulele related?
I'm always working on. I'd love to do a revised second edition of the book. I'm working on a journal article about the tour of the Royal Hawaiian Band on the mainland United States in 1895, 96, and what that tells us about the politics of Hawaiian music. And I still, crank out magazine pieces occasionally.
Fantastic. The revised edition of the book, is that because you've uncovered more stuff, or you feel you missed something out, or?
Um, John and I were researching the book and adding stuff to it until we submitted the final manuscript. Um, there's always more to, more certainly come to light. There's more resources that are available online now, so you don't have to, go to a library and physically and look it up. There's some annoying typos that I'd like to fix. Um, but and it's been 8 years since the book came. A lot has happened since then. I mean, in the contemporary ukulele uh, uh, situation has evolved in some really interesting ways, and so there's a whole, arguably a whole nother chapter there to be written.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you for that. Now, the last thing that I like to ask everybody, you can go on a car journey, Jim, and you can take anyone with you, past or present. And I want to know where you're going to go. I want to know what you're going to listen to on the stereo, obviously who you're with, and what car you'd be
Um, well, given a choice, I would get my great great grandfather and Manuel Nunez and Jose tu Espiritu Santo. We wouldn't listen to the stereo because I would want to hear my great great grandfather play as we drove.
in.
Get a sense of his level of skill and his repertoire and all that sort of thing. Um, I would want to put them all together in a big American convertible, like a 1975 Cadillac or a Buick or something like that with the top down, and drive around Honolulu and take a sort of historical tour. Yeah, I remember when I had the shop here and we did that, and that's the historian in me. I would just, the tape would be rolling, and I would be able to capture all this stuff and finally ask all the questions that I've wanted to ask those guys.
Wouldn't that be amazing? It sounds like a film, that does. Let's do it. Let's make a film about that. It'd just be great. I mean, what would they think now that we're sat here, 130 years later after the first ukuleles, talking about it over a strange thing called a computer? What would they make of this? How it's spread, and the phenomenon that it is in England and everywhere.
I think they would be totally astonished, to be honest, because they certainly, when again they were trying to make a living, and they were using the skills that they had and building the instruments that they knew how to build, and the idea that this would become an international phenomenon, and that in the 1920s would be the best-selling instrument in the United States, and there's no way they could have foreseen that.
Yeah, He might turn around and say, I told you so. I told you we were onto a good thing. There you go. Thank you for that answer. It's been so great chatting to you, Jim. I knew it would be. Thank you so much for writing this wonderful book. I'm about to start it for the 3rd time, and I recommend it to all of my students. So thank you very much for your time. I'm just going to press the stop record, and then we'll have a little chat afterwards.
Thank you, Paul.